The leather portfolio slipped from Harrison Whitmore's hands at exactly 6:47 in the morning, spilling correspondence across his study floor in a cascade of cream-colored paper. Prudence, who had been dusting the bookshelf with her back carefully turned, heard the muttered curse, the rustle of papers being gathered hastily, the slam of the portfolio onto the mahogany desk. Her master's footsteps retreated toward the breakfast room, leaving behind what he always left behind. Evidence of his carelessness and proof of his assumptions about who was watching. She waited 30 seconds, counting silently while her cloth moved in steady circles across the leather spines of books her master had purchased but never read. Then she turned and saw what she had been listening for. A single sheet had slid beneath the desk, invisible from the doorway but perfectly visible from where she stood. Prudence crossed the Turkish carpet without sound, her worn shoes making no impression on the thick wool. She knelt as if to retrieve a piece of lint, and her fingers closed around the paper. The letter was dated 3 days earlier, written in the angular script of a Charleston factor named Elias Pemberton. Prudence's eyes moved across the text with practiced speed, her excellent memory capturing each word before her hands could tremble enough to betray her. Quarterly payment received for transport services rendered. Notation of increased cotton yields from the Magnolia Creek operation. Reference to 127 productive hands currently in field rotation. And a final line that made her breath catch. Your investment continues to prove most profitable, with returns exceeding our initial projections by 18%. She heard footsteps in the hallway. Her fingers released the paper, letting it settle back into the shadow beneath the desk where her master would find it later and assume it had simply been overlooked. Prudence rose smoothly, her face arranging itself into the blank pleasantness that white people found reassuring in their servants, and was dusting the windowsill when Harrison Whitmore returned, coffee cup in hand, already thinking about his morning appointments at the counting house. He never glanced at her. In 15 years of service, he had looked directly at Prudence perhaps a dozen times, and even then his gaze had passed through her the way it might pass through furniture or wallpaper. Useful, necessary, but not quite real enough to register as human presence requiring acknowledgement. This invisibility had protected her since the day she arrived in this house at 17, purchased from a Virginia estate sale like a piece of particularly promising livestock. It had allowed her to teach herself the patterns of his business, the rhythm of his correspondence, the careless way he left sensitive documents scattered across surfaces he assumed only he could read. Now that same invisibility had become something else entirely. Not protection, but opportunity. Mother Bethel Church occupied a narrow building on the north slope of Beacon Hill, wedged between a boarding house and a cobbler's shop in the part of the neighborhood where Boston's black residents, free and enslaved, carved out space in a city that preferred to pretend they didn't exist. Prudence attended services every Sunday, one of the few liberties Harrison Whitmore permitted because it aligned with his self-image as a benevolent master who respected his servants' spiritual needs. What happened after services, in the small room behind the sanctuary where women gathered ostensibly to plan church socials and coordinate charitable works, existed beyond her master's awareness entirely. Charlotte Webb was rolling out pie dough when Prudence entered the church kitchen on a Thursday evening in February, her hands working the pin with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. She was 41, had purchased her own freedom 12 years earlier with wages saved over 2 decades. And now served as head cook in the household of Josiah Crane, whose bank financed cotton factors throughout the South. She looked up as Prudence closed the door, her expression revealing nothing, but her hands stilled on the rolling pin. Prudence had rehearsed this conversation for 3 weeks, testing different approaches, discarding anything that might sound too direct or too vague. What emerged was simple enough to seem casual, but specific enough to signal intent. Your employer keeps his study unlocked when he travels, Prudence said, moving to the wash basin as if she'd come simply to clean her hands. I've noticed his correspondence sometimes discusses plantation investments, the same investments my master participates in. Charlotte resumed rolling, the pin moving in steady strokes that suggested her mind was working faster than her hands. Mr. Crane leaves many papers on his desk. He assumes his cook has no interest in reading them. He would be incorrect in that assumption. The coded admission hung between them. Prudence dried her hands slowly, choosing her next words with care. Information has value, particularly information that connects respectable Boston merchants to activities they publicly claim to find distasteful. Documentation might prove useful, Charlotte agreed, her tone still discussing nothing more controversial than recipes. Though what one does with such documentation requires considerable thought. Exposure brings risk. These men protect themselves well. Exposure isn't what I'm considering. Prudence turned from the basin, meeting Charlotte's eyes directly for the first time. I'm thinking about redistribution, using their own mechanisms against them. But it would require more than one person's knowledge. It would need a network. Charlotte's hand stopped again. For a long moment, the only sound was the settling of coals in the kitchen stove. Then she nodded once, a single, decisive movement. There's a prayer meeting next Thursday evening. I know 3 other women who might be interested in discussing this further. Women with access similar to ours. 3 is a beginning, Prudence said, though we'll need to be extraordinarily careful about who joins this conversation. Oh, I'm always careful, Charlotte replied, returning to her dough with renewed focus. 41 years of surviving in white folks' houses teaches caution better than any schooling ever could. The prayer meeting assembled 5 women in the back room of Mother Bethel on a March evening when sleet rattled against the windows and provided convenient cover for a gathering that needed to appear entirely ordinary. Prudence had brought something folded inside her Bible, a single page copied during the pre-dawn hours when Harrison Whitmore's house lay silent and she could work by candlelight in his study. She unfolded it now on the scarred wooden table, the paper showing a ledger entry in her master's precise handwriting. March 1834. Quarterly payment received from E. Pemberton, Charleston, $2,847. Cotton transport fees plus investment return from Magnolia Creek operation, 127 hands, increased field rotation schedule yielding 18% above projections. The 4 other women leaned forward, reading in silence. Dinah Foster, who served the Hewitt household and had access to ledgers documenting textile mill investments. Grace Williams, housekeeper for a lawyer who drafted plantation contracts. Rebecca Townsend, whose employers owned shipping lines that transported slave-produced goods. And Charlotte, who had brought them together. This is one man's business dealings, Prudence said quietly. One household's financial connection to slavery. But if we compared what each of us sees in our respective positions, I suspect we'd find a web connecting most of Beacon Hill's wealthy families to the same system. They profit from it while maintaining that they're morally superior to Southern plantation owners. They're not. They're just better at hiding their complicity. Documentation proves complicity, Grace said, her finger tracing the ledger entry. But documentation alone accomplishes nothing. These men own the courts, the newspapers, the mechanisms of power. Exposing them creates scandal they'll survive while we're punished for theft of private papers. I'm not proposing exposure. Prudence refolded the paper carefully. I'm proposing something more direct. We document their wealth and its sources. Then we begin redirecting it. Small amounts initially move through the same legal channels they use. Forged donation receipts, altered contract terms, missing pages from ledgers. Their own financial complexity becomes cover for taking back what was built on stolen labor. The room went very quiet. What Prudence was describing crossed from observation into action, from witnessing to intervening. The risk was extraordinary. Discovery meant death or sale to the Deep South, fates that made current servitude seem almost bearable by comparison. How much could we actually move? Dinah asked finally. And where would it go? I'm thinking hundreds per household over time, not thousands, Prudence replied. Amounts small enough to attribute to clerical errors if noticed at all. The money would go to abolition societies, to helping people purchase freedom, to supporting the Underground Railroad. We become a different kind of underground network, not helping people escape, but helping dismantle the system by starving it of resources one falsified receipt at a time. Charlotte had been studying the ledger entry with the focused attention she brought to complex recipes. This requires skills beyond simple literacy. We'd need to forge signatures perfectly, understand legal and financial terminology, coordinate across multiple households without raising suspicion, and it would take years to accomplish anything meaningful. Years of absolute secrecy and perfect execution. Yes, Prudence said simply. But we have something they don't. Patience born from having no choice but to wait. Intelligence they've spent our entire lives underestimating. And access they've granted us because they literally cannot imagine we're capable of using it against them. Rebecca leaned back, her expression troubled. Two of us are enslaved. If we're caught, we don't even have the limited legal protections free black people can sometimes claim. They'll make examples of us. They would, Prudence agreed. Which is why we don't get caught. We move slowly. We stay small. We help each other maintain the same perfect servitude we've always shown. We become what they already believe us to be. Invisible, simple, loyal. And behind that mask, we build something they'll never see. Until it's far too late. The decision didn't come that night. The women dispersed with agreement, only to consider what had been proposed and to maintain absolute silence about the conversation. But 3 weeks later, when they gathered again, all 5 had made the same choice. They would begin with documentation, spending months simply recording what they observed. And then, when they understood the full scope of their master's financial entanglements, they would take the far more dangerous step of intervention. Grace Williams stood in Attorney Ashford's study on a December afternoon, dusting bookshelves while her employer sorted through papers belonging to his client, Cornelius Blackwell. The elderly merchant's estate organization had been ongoing for weeks, and Ashford's frustration with his client's disorganized records had created exactly the opportunity the network had been waiting for. Charitable donations scattered across a dozen different receipts, Ashford muttered, more to himself than to the servant he'd long since ceased noticing. The man gives money away but can't remember to whom or in what amounts. His heirs will have fits trying to settle this estate. Grace's cloth moved in steady circles across leather spines while her mind calculated possibilities. She had practiced Cornelius Blackwell's signature for 6 weeks. Working from discarded letters retrieved from the Ashford household's wastebaskets. She had located paper stock similar to what the Seamen's Aid Society used for donation receipts. She had prepared ink that matched the fading on documents from the same period. Tonight, in her small room in the Ashford servants' quarters, she would create a single falsified receipt. $50 from Blackwell to the Seamen's Aid Society. Except the money would actually go to the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. Tomorrow, when Ashford resumed his sorting, she would slip the receipt into the pile of charitable documents requiring organization. If it passed unnoticed, if Blackwell confirmed the donation without remembering the exact amount or recipient, it would prove the concept. Their master's own complexity, their reliance on paper documentation they couldn't be bothered to organize carefully, had created vulnerability. The network had spent 10 months documenting that vulnerability across a dozen households. Now they would test whether documentation could become action. Grace's hands didn't shake as she worked, though her heart was beating hard enough that she wondered if Ashford might hear it across the room. This wasn't anger driving her forward, or even revenge, though she had plenty of both. This was something colder and more patient. A belief that intelligence could find cracks in any system, no matter how thoroughly designed to be impenetrable. That people dismissed as incapable of complex thought could prove more strategically sophisticated than those who'd spent lifetimes underestimating them. Ashford gathered his papers and left the study, already thinking about his evening meal, never glancing at the woman who continued dusting in steady, unremarkable rhythm. Grace waited until his footsteps faded down the hallway. Then she allowed herself one moment of stillness, her cloth pressed against a bookshelf, her eyes closed, her breath carefully controlled. Tomorrow the accounting would truly begin. Not the financial accounting her master obsessed over, but a different kind of reckoning entirely. One that would take years to fully manifest, that would require precision beyond what anyone thought servant women capable of, but that would ultimately prove that even in a system designed to deny their humanity, they retained the capacity to resist in ways their oppressors never imagined possible. The invisibility imposed upon them had created the conditions for something unprecedented. Now they would see just how far that invisibility could carry them before the men who'd never bothered to truly see them finally understood what had been happening in their own houses all along. The first falsified receipt passed through Attorney Ashford's review on a Tuesday morning while Grace Williams stood 3 feet away, polishing the silver tea service her employer's wife had requested for afternoon guests. Grace's hands moved in steady circles across the ornate surface, but her peripheral vision tracked every movement as Ashford sorted through Cornelius Blackwell's charitable donation records, his fingers pausing briefly on the receipt she had created, then moving past it without comment. She waited until he left for his office downtown before allowing herself to breathe fully. The forged document, $50 supposedly donated to the Seamen's Aid Society but actually redirected to the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, had disappeared into the administrative machinery of a state settlement as if it had always existed. Grace reported this success at the April meeting in Mother Bethel's back room, and for the first time since they had moved from documentation to intervention, the women allowed themselves to believe their methods might actually work. But Prudence's response to the celebration was characteristically cautious. She produced from her Bible a piece of paper covered in her precise handwriting, what she called the garden schedule. Like any garden, she explained, their work required understanding of seasons, of when to plant and when to wait for harvest, of patient cultivation that couldn't be rushed without destroying what they were trying to grow. One success means we proved the concept, Prudence said, her finger tracing the columns she had drawn showing the 12 households now in their network. But repetition is what will either establish our methods or expose our vulnerabilities. We need to expand operations, but we need to do it with the same care we used for this first attempt, which means each of you needs to develop expertise in the specific opportunities your household presents. Over the following weeks, the network began what Prudence called specialization. Grace would focus on estate settlements and charitable receipts, exploiting the disorganization that seemed to characterize wealthy men's record-keeping of donations they made primarily for social standing. Charlotte would work with business correspondents in Josiah Crane's banking papers, identifying contracts where altered terms might redirect payments. Dinah Foster, who had a natural facility with numbers that had gone unrecognized her entire life, would target investment documents and dividend payments. The variation was deliberate. If every household experienced the same type of discrepancy, eventually someone would notice the pattern. But if each intervention was unique to its specific context, the overall operation would remain invisible to men who never compared notes about minor financial irregularities. Charlotte's kitchen in the Crane household became something more than a workspace that summer. On Sunday afternoons, when the Crane family made their weekly social calls that stretched for hours, the kitchen filled with women ostensibly helping prepare the week's meals. But the actual work happening around the scarred wooden table had nothing to do with cooking. Grace sat across from Dinah, practicing signatures. She had brought samples of Theodore Ashford's handwriting, collected from letters she had retrieved from wastebaskets over months of careful gathering. Now she was learning to replicate the particular way his capital T leaned slightly right, how his final strokes often trailed upward, the rhythm of his pen pressure across a page. "You're thinking too much about individual letters," Dinah said, watching Grace's careful attempts. "Handwriting is rhythm more than shape. Feel how his hand moved, not just what marks it left." Dinah demonstrated, her own pen flowing across paper in a signature that looked nothing like her natural hand but perfectly matched the sample. She had been practicing her employer Samuel Hewitt's signature for weeks and had achieved a fluency that made the forgery almost invisible. At the other end of the table, Rebecca Townsend was teaching Charlotte how to read shipping manifests, explaining the codes that indicated cargo types and destinations. "See here, where it says general merchandise with this notation, That's cotton. They don't write it plainly in the Boston records because they want plausible deniability about handling slave-produced goods. But the notation system is consistent across the shipping companies. Charlotte absorbed this information with the same focused attention she brought to complex recipes. Understanding how her employer's bank financed these shipping operations meant understanding what the manifests actually documented, which meant learning a language designed to obscure its own meaning. Prudence moved between the conversations, observing, occasionally correcting technique, ensuring that knowledge was being transferred effectively. This informal education was producing expertise that would have impressed professional clerks and accountants. These women were teaching themselves skills white society insisted black people were intellectually incapable of mastering, and doing so well enough to manipulate the financial instruments of Boston's commercial elite without detection. The quilting circle they had established as cover met Wednesday evenings at Mother Bethel, providing public evidence of wholesome activity while the actual intelligence sharing happened in coded conversation. Rebecca arrived at one April meeting complaining about a particularly stubborn wine stain on table linens, which the others understood meant her household's financial records had been recently audited and intervention activities needed temporary suspension. Grace's discussion of a recipe's complicated preparation steps actually communicated the multi-stage process required for an estate document forgery she was planning. The coding system had been Rebecca's innovation, developed in what they called the recipe book, an actual collection of cooking instructions that doubled as an operational manual. Ingredients lists corresponded to document types. Preparation methods described forgery techniques. Cooking times indicated intervals between operations. The book circulated among members as a useful collection of dishes their employers enjoyed, entirely innocent if discovered, but a comprehensive guide to their actual work for those who understood its true purpose. The crisis that tested everything they had built arrived on October morning in 1837, though Grace didn't recognize it immediately as a crisis. She was dusting the bookshelves in Attorney Ashford's study when he entered with a man she had never seen before, a thin figure with wire-rimmed spectacles and the methodical air of someone accustomed to finding errors in other people's work. "This is Mr. Horace Dalton," Ashford said, not bothering to introduce Grace because servants didn't require such courtesies. "He'll be conducting a comprehensive audit of the Theodore Ashford estate. Please ensure he has access to whatever documents he requires and that he's not disturbed while working." Grace nodded with appropriate deference and left the study, her mind already racing. An audit meant professional scrutiny of every document, verification of every transaction, the kind of systematic review their forgeries were designed to survive individually, but that might reveal patterns if examined comprehensively. She reported the development at the emergency meeting Prudence called for that evening, gathering in the church basement while autumn rain provided cover for an unscheduled assembly. "The Theodore Ashford estate includes the bond operation," Grace said, her voice steady despite the fear tightening her chest. "The $2,000 we moved through falsified sale documentation. If this auditor is thorough, he'll verify the sale records, might contact the Philadelphia businessman I used as the fictional purchaser." Prudence had been making notes in her household ledger, the coded entries that documented every operation. "What's the auditor's reputation? Is he someone who does surface review or deep investigation?" "I don't know him," Grace admitted. "But Ashford wouldn't have hired him if he wasn't thorough. The creditors are pushing for comprehensive accounting." The network spent that meeting preparing defensive positions. Their story would be simple. Theodore Ashford's chaotic record-keeping made perfect accounting impossible. Any discrepancies reflected his poor business practices, not deliberate fraud. But defense only worked if the forgeries themselves were flawless. Over the following weeks, Grace maintained careful surveillance, reporting every development. Horace Dalton worked with methodical precision, reviewing documents in chronological order, making notes in a leather journal, occasionally requesting additional papers from the estate files. Grace watched him when she brought tea, when she emptied ashtrays, during the invisible moments when servants moved through rooms and their employers forgot they existed. Dalton was dangerous. She recognized it in the way he cross-referenced documents, checking details between multiple sources, the way he would pause over a page and return to it hours later as if something had troubled him that required additional consideration. This was not a man who would miss the kind of subtle inconsistencies that cursory review overlooked. The crisis broke on a Tuesday in late October. Grace was cleaning the hallway outside Ashford's study when she heard Dalton's voice, carrying the particular tone of someone who had discovered something significant. The Philadelphia businessman listed as purchaser of these railroad bonds. I've verified his existence through business directories, but something troubled me about the timing, so I checked newspaper archives. Grace's hand stilled on the banister she had been polishing. Through the partially open door, she could see Dalton holding the forged correspondence she had created months earlier. Augustus Pemberton died 3 months before the date on this letter. Heart failure, according to his obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer, which means either your cousin Theodore was conducting business with a dead man, or these documents are not what they appear to be. The hallway seemed to tilt. Grace had created perfect forgeries, had aged the paper correctly, had replicated Theodore's signature with absolute precision, but she had no way to verify the fictional purchaser's status because she had no access to newspapers from other cities, no resources beyond what she could gather in her employer's house. The limitation that had seemed minor during planning had become the vulnerability that might destroy everything. Attorney Ashford's response drifted through the doorway. My cousin's mental state declined significantly in his final years. Perhaps he was confused about dates or corresponded with someone else whose name he misremembered. Theodore's records were notoriously unreliable. Perhaps, Dalton said, though his tone suggested he found this explanation insufficient. I'll need to interview the household staff. Sometimes servants remember details about visitors and correspondence that provide clarity. Grace descended the stairs with legs that felt disconnected from her body. She had perhaps an hour before Dalton would summon her for questioning, an hour to prepare the performance that might determine whether she lived or died. The interview happened in Ashford's study at 2 o'clock. Grace entered with the anxious deference of a servant, unsure why she had been summoned, her hands clasped in front of her apron, her eyes downcast in the posture white people found appropriately submissive. Horace Dalton sat behind the desk, his spectacles catching lamplight in a way that made his eyes difficult to read. Attorney Ashford stood by the window, watching the street outside as if this matter barely concerned him. You've been with this household for how long? Dalton asked, his pen poised over his journal. 11 years, sir, since I was 20. And you would have known the deceased, Theodore Ashford? Yes, sir. He visited sometimes before his health failed. He was kind, though quite forgetful in his later years. Dalton made a note. Do you recall him receiving visitors from Philadelphia? A businessman named Augustus Pemberton, perhaps? Grace allowed herself to look confused, as if trying to remember details that had never been important to her. Mr. Theodore mentioned Philadelphia sometimes, sir. He had business there, I think, but I don't recall specific names. He received many visitors before his illness worsened. Did you ever carry correspondence for him? Letters to or from Philadelphia? I might have, sir. I carried many letters to the post for Mr. Theodore, but I couldn't say where they were addressed. That wasn't my concern. The answer was perfect, the response of a servant who had been present but not truly paying attention, who had performed tasks without understanding their significance. Grace saw Dalton's shoulders relax slightly, saw him make another note that likely read, Household staff unreliable for detailed verification. In his final months, would you say Mr. Theodore's memory was sound? Grace hesitated, as if reluctant to speak ill of the deceased. He was quite elderly, sir. Sometimes he would tell me things twice, forgetting he had already mentioned them. Or he would ask for people to visit who had been dead for years. It troubled the family greatly. Dalton nodded slowly, closing his journal. That will be all. Thank you for your time. Grace curtsied and left, her heart pounding so hard she was certain they must hear it. But she had done what prudence had taught them all to do. She had played precisely into expectations of limited intelligence and imperfect memory, had given Dalton exactly the kind of vague, unhelpful information that confirmed Theodore's records were unreliable without raising suspicion of deliberate fraud. The audit concluded 2 weeks later with a report noting significant irregularities in Theodore Ashford's estate, but attributing them to poor business practices and cognitive decline. The bond discrepancy was listed as unresolved, the documentation insufficient to determine what had actually transpired. Horace Dalton recommended against pursuing further investigation, noting that the costs would likely exceed any recoverable assets. Grace reported this outcome at the November meeting, and for the first time since Dalton had appeared, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of how close they had come to catastrophic exposure. "We gambled and won," Prudence said after Grace had finished her account. "But gambling isn't strategy. The Theodore Ashford operation achieved significant results. $2,000, that's already helping people purchase freedom. But the risk-to-reward ratio was actually unfavorable. We got lucky that Dalton accepted the explanation about Theodore's confusion. The next time, we might not be." The discussion that followed was sober, marked by new understanding of their vulnerability. Charlotte spoke first, her voice carrying the weight of experience. "We need to return to smaller operations, more distributed across households, less concentrated risk in single large interventions. We also need better intelligence," Grace added. "I couldn't have known about Pemberton's death because I have no access to newspapers from other cities. We need someone who can verify details we can't check ourselves." The suggestion led to expansion the network had been avoiding, recruiting a free black member with resources and mobility beyond what enslaved or servant women possessed. Someone who could move through the city without requiring a pass, who could access libraries and newspaper archives, who could verify information that might prevent the next near disaster. The recruitment of James Whitfield took 3 months of careful vetting. He was a freeman who worked as a clerk in a black-owned shipping company, had connections to the abolitionist community, and most importantly, possessed the discretion necessary for the kind of work the network required. Prudence approached him through church connections in January of 1838, and by March he had been fully integrated into their operations. James brought capabilities the network had desperately needed. He could verify business information through public records, could check newspaper archives for details about people and companies they planned to use in forgeries, could serve as intermediary for moving funds to abolition causes in ways that didn't trace back to suspicious servants making unexpected donations. His first contribution prevented what might have been a significant mistake. Dinah had identified an investment opportunity involving railroad development bonds her employer had purchased. She had spent weeks mapping the complex dividend payment structure, identifying an intervention point where she could redirect funds. But before executing the operation, she asked James to verify the railroad company's status. His research revealed the company was under investigation for fraud, its bonds likely worthless, its dividend payments about to cease entirely. Dinah's intervention would have accomplished nothing except potentially drawing attention when the scheme collapsed and investigators reviewed all transactions. James's verification saved them from wasted effort and possible exposure. With James handling external intelligence, the network's operations became more sophisticated. They could verify details, could plan interventions with greater confidence, could move money through channels James established with abolitionist organizations that needed support, but couldn't publicly acknowledge receiving funds redirected from slavery's beneficiaries. The summer of 1839 brought what Prudence called the harvest season, when multiple operations across different households came to fruition simultaneously. Grace had been working for months on a complex estate settlement that allowed her to redirect $800 through falsified charitable receipts. Charlotte had altered bank correspondence in ways that shifted $300 from cotton factor payments to anti-slavery society accounts. Dinah had manipulated dividend payments from textile mill investments, moving small amounts from multiple sources that accumulated to over $1,000. Rebecca stood before the network's August meeting describing her own success with shipping manifests. The Livingston Company maintains duplicate records, one showing actual cargo and one showing cargo for customs purposes. The discrepancy is deliberate. designed to underreport slave-produced goods and avoid duties. But it also means alterations to the customs records are never verified against the actual manifests. I've been redirecting surcharges they should have paid, sending the difference to Underground Railroad operations. Over 6 months, nearly $600. The collective success was extraordinary. In a single season, they had moved over $2,700, more than they had managed in the previous 3 years combined. The technical sophistication they had developed, the coordination between members, the intelligence James provided, all of it had created capacity far beyond what they had imagined possible when they began with a single falsified receipt. But the success brought new questions that Charlotte raised as the meeting was concluding. We're moving meaningful amounts now, enough that it's making real difference for people purchasing freedom, for legal defense, for Underground Railroad operations. But I look at the total wealth these households control, and our interventions are still barely noticeable. Are we doing enough? Can we do enough? The question hung in the room without answer. They had helped dozens of people, had funded causes that might save hundreds more. But the system they were fighting controlled millions in wealth, owned thousands of human beings, had institutional power that dwarfed their individual efforts. Prudence had been quiet through most of the meeting, listening to the reports of success, watching the network she had built demonstrate capabilities that would have shocked anyone who believed enslaved and servant women incapable of strategic sophistication. Now she opened her household ledger to the master accounting she maintained, the comprehensive record of every operation over 4 years. 47 interventions across 12 households, she read. $5,800 total redirection. 23 families helped to purchase freedom. Legal defense funded for 12 fugitive slave cases. Support provided to Underground Railroad operations in 4 states. She closed the ledger and looked at the women gathered around the table. Charlotte asks if we're doing enough. The honest answer is no. We could move 10 times what we're moving and it wouldn't dismantle this system. But that's not actually the question we should be asking. Then what is? Grace asked. Whether what we're doing matters. And the answer to that is yes, absolutely yes. 23 families are free who wouldn't be. 12 people got legal defense that might save their lives. Underground Railroad conductors can continue their work because mysterious donations appeared when they needed resources. We're not ending slavery, but we're creating cracks in it, proving it's not invulnerable, demonstrating that intelligence and determination can fight power, even when you have no formal authority. Prudence paused, choosing her next words carefully. And we're teaching ourselves something these men have spent their lives trying to convince us isn't true. That we're capable of anything they are. That the only difference between us and them is that they had advantages we were denied, not that they possess superior intelligence or ability. Every operation we successfully execute proves that. Every dollar we redirect demonstrates it. We're not just fighting for the people we help directly, we're fighting for the truth about who we actually are. Winter of 1839 settled over Boston while the network continued their patient work. The operations had become almost routine, executed with practiced efficiency that would have seemed impossible 4 years earlier when they were nervously attempting their first intervention. Prudence sat in her attic room on the shortest day of the year, reviewing the master ledger by candlelight. The numbers told a story of systematic resistance, of intelligence deployed against power, of servants and enslaved women proving themselves more strategically capable than the masters who dismissed them as incapable of complex thought. But the numbers also told a story of limitations. They could move money, could create pressure on the system, could help specific individuals escape bondage. But they couldn't break the fundamental structure that allowed human beings to be bought and sold, that treated people as property, that built wealth on stolen labor and stolen lives. The limitations didn't make the work meaningless. 23 freed families would never be meaningless. But they made the work incomplete. And Prudence understood that incompleteness would define everything they accomplished. They were fighting a battle they couldn't win completely, only make slightly less terrible for specific people they would mostly never meet. Outside her small window, snow began to fall across Beacon Hill, covering the elegant townhouses in white that would be pristine until morning when servants emerged to clear the walks and restore the illusion of effortless elegance that wealth required. Those servants moved through spaces their employers barely noticed, cleaned rooms where documents lay scattered, heard conversations about investments and profits and the systematic exploitation that sustained Boston's commercial prosperity. And some of those servants, invisible but attentive, patient but determined, were carefully, methodically, systematically working to redirect that wealth toward its own destruction. They were teaching themselves expertise white society insisted they couldn't possess. They were building networks across households that should have remained isolated. They were proving through every successful operation that intelligence and determination could create possibilities power tried to deny. The garden was growing, its harvest measured not in the total destruction of an evil system, but in the specific lives it touched, the families it freed, the resistance it made possible. Prudence had learned to accept that incompleteness, to find meaning in partial victories, to understand that sometimes fighting impossible battles was its own form of triumph. The accounting continued. The snow fell, and in the invisible spaces between master and servant, between wealth and poverty, between enslavement and freedom, a quiet revolution grew stronger with each season, patient and persistent as the gardens it was named for, cultivating possibilities that would eventually flower in ways even its architects couldn't fully imagine. The letter arrived at Harrison Whitmore's townhouse on a March morning in 1842, delivered by a courier from the law offices of Pendleton and Sons, with instructions that it required the master's immediate attention. Prudence accepted it at the door, carried it to Whitmore's study on a silver tray, and placed it on his desk with the morning's other correspondence. She had learned long ago which letters warranted interrupting his breakfast and which could wait, and the heavy linen paper with its embossed legal seal suggested something significant enough to present immediately. What she couldn't have known, standing in the doorway while Whitmore broke the seal and began reading, was that this letter would eventually unravel everything the network had built over 8 years of patient work. Whitmore's face changed as he read, the casual expression of a man reviewing routine business correspondence, transforming into something sharper, more focused. He read the letter twice, then stood abruptly and moved to the window, staring out at Mount Vernon Street while his fingers drummed against the frame, in a rhythm Prudence recognized as agitation. He instructed Prudence to send word to his office about a delay, and to inform Mrs. Whitmore he needed to speak with her before her social calls. Prudence delivered these messages and returned to her regular duties, but the letter remained visible on Whitmore's desk throughout the morning, and she used the opportunity while refreshing the study's flowers to read its opening paragraph upside down, a skill she had perfected over years of necessity. The letterhead identified Pendleton and Sons, attorneys at law, and the first visible lines referenced routine review of financial records, irregularities discovered, charitable donations questioned, estate settlements requiring verification. The correspondence mentioned multiple prominent Boston families, suggested coordinated investigation, requested comprehensive documentation. Prudence's hands continued their steady work with the flower arrangement, her face revealing nothing of the cold fear spreading through her chest. This wasn't a single household audit like the Theodore Ashford crisis. This was systematic review across multiple families, the kind of coordinated investigation that suggested someone had identified a pattern. She reported the development at the emergency meeting that evening, gathering in Mother Bethel's basement while March wine provided cover for urgent assembly. The fear in the room was palpable, in ways it hadn't been even during their closest previous calls. A pattern meant someone had compared information across households, had seen connections that should have remained invisible, had recognized that seemingly unrelated discrepancies might actually be coordinated interventions. Charlotte reported similar correspondence arriving at the Crane household, Josiah Crane's fury about incompetent bookkeeping and threats to dismiss staff if records weren't immediately organized. Grace had observed the same legal seal on correspondence delivered to Attorney Ashford's office. 3 households confirmed, possibly more. The investigation's breadth suggested the pattern had become visible to whoever was conducting the review. Dinah sat in unusual silence through these reports, her hands folded on the table, her expression carrying guilt that made Prudence's apprehension intensify. When pressed, Dinah explained her error from the previous month. A dividend payment she had redirected had been routed through the wrong intermediary account. Instead of using the Textile Workers Benevolent Fund as planned, she had accidentally sent funds to the same Anti-Slavery Society account Grace had used for a charitable receipt alteration weeks earlier. 2 different operations, 2 different households, but money arriving at the same destination within days of each other. The implications settled over the group like physical weight. Their entire methodology had been built on variation, on ensuring no 2 interventions followed the same pattern, on distributing operations so widely that connections remained invisible. But a single routing mistake had created exactly the kind of correlation professional investigators looked for. James Whitfield arrived with additional intelligence gathered through his connections in Boston's commercial district. The investigation had been triggered not by Dinah's error alone, but by something more complex. The Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society had discovered internal embezzlement, had conducted an audit of their own records, and had found discrepancies in donation documentation. Several large contributions appeared to have come from sources who denied making them or couldn't recall the specific amounts when contacted for routine acknowledgement. The Society's leadership, desperate to prove they weren't complicit in embezzlement and were cooperating fully with authorities, had provided complete access to their financial records. Those records showed a pattern of unexpected donations over several years, contributions from wealthy Boston families who either denied making them or expressed confusion about the amounts claimed. The law firm of Pendleton & Sons had been retained by several families to investigate whether they had been defrauded, whether someone had been making donations in their names without authorization, whether their charitable giving records had been falsified for tax fraud or social misrepresentation purposes. James's most troubling news concerned the investigator coordinating the review. Horace Dalton, the same auditor who had nearly exposed the Theodore Ashford bond forgery, was now examining patterns that connected multiple households. The man whose methodical precision had troubled Grace years earlier, who had checked newspaper archives to verify a deceased businessman's timeline, was now building comprehensive documentation across the entire network's operations. The timeline James had learned suggested weeks, possibly a month, before Dalton would complete his initial review and make recommendations about pursuing criminal investigation. The families were requesting documentation, comparing their own records against the Anti-Slavery Society's deposit records, looking for discrepancies in amounts, dates, and claimed sources. Prudence calculated exposure risks with the same methodical attention she brought to all strategic planning. 5 years of comprehensive review would capture most of their significant operations. The network had been active for 8 years, but the first 3 had involved smaller interventions, amounts less likely to draw attention. The past 5 years, when they had become more sophisticated and moved larger sums, would show the pattern most clearly. The defensive strategy they developed relied on fragmentation and plausible deniability. Each household's discrepancies would need individual explanations that made coordination seem unlikely. Clerical errors by the Anti-Slavery Society's embezzling clerk. Confusion about which family members had made donations. Mistakes in date recording that made single donations appear multiple times in different records. The explanations didn't need perfection, just sufficient plausibility to create reasonable doubt about deliberate fraud. But the strategy required perfect coordination among people who weren't supposed to be capable of coordinating. They would need to ensure their employers' explanations aligned with defensive narratives without appearing to influence anything. Subtle guidance toward interpretations that fragmented the pattern rather than revealing its systematic nature. Prudence stood in Harrison Whitmore's study on an April morning, organizing correspondence with meticulous attention while Whitmore reviewed documents Horace Dalton had requested. His frustration manifested in the way he kept setting papers aside and returning to them, as if hoping they would make more sense on subsequent readings. His muttered complaints about discrepancies in anti-slavery society records versus his own ledgers provided Prudence the opening she needed. She paused in her sorting, arranged her face in concerned attentiveness, and suggested that perhaps the society's clerk had made recording errors, given the embezzlement problems recently discovered there. If their records were poorly maintained, mistakes would be expected. Whitmore seized this explanation with visible relief, agreeing that unreliable records would certainly explain discrepancies. Prudence carefully added that she recalled him making a separate donation to the Seamen's Aid Society during the same period in question. Perhaps clerks had confused which organization received which amount. The suggestion was pure fabrication, but it gave Whitmore a second explanation that made the discrepancy seem more like administrative confusion than deliberate fraud. She watched him make notes to check his Seamen's Aid Society records, knowing he would find documentation there that seemed to support this interpretation, because Grace had created it years earlier. Similar conversations were happening across multiple households as network members carefully shaped how their employers understood the discrepancies Dalton was discovering. Not overt manipulation that might be detected, but gentle steering toward explanations that fragmented the pattern rather than revealing coordination. The strategy might have succeeded if Horace Dalton had been less systematic in his investigation, but Dalton was employing exactly the methodical approach that had made him dangerous during the Theodore Ashford audit. He was cross-referencing everything, building comprehensive timelines, looking for connections that transcended individual household explanations. And he found one. James brought news of the discovery to their May meeting, his expression communicating severity before he spoke. Dalton had been reviewing Josiah Crane's banking correspondence and had noticed unusual patterns in contract modifications over several years. Small changes to payment terms, adjusted interest calculations, redirected funds, each individually explainable as clerical corrections but collectively suggesting systematic intervention. The devastating detail was that Dalton had found a modified contract from 1838 with a critical error. Charlotte had forged the document carefully, aging the paper and replicating Crane's signature with practiced precision. The forgery was nearly perfect except for one technical mistake. The ink she had used, while matching the color and consistency of period-appropriate ink, had been manufactured with a formula that wasn't commercially available until 1839. Chemical analysis conducted as part of Dalton's comprehensive review had revealed the anachronism. The technical error was minute, the kind of detail only sophisticated forensic analysis would detect. But it proved deliberate forgery rather than clerical mistake, which transformed the investigation's entire nature. Dalton now possessed certainty that at least one document in the Crane household had been intentionally falsified. The question became whether this represented isolated fraud or evidence of broader coordination. James reported that Dalton was requesting permission to conduct similar chemical analysis on documents from other households. If he found the same anachronism in forgeries from different families, it would prove coordination. And once coordination was established, investigation would focus on identifying who had access to all these households, who could have executed interventions across multiple families. The answer pointed directly at servants, the only people who moved between households, who had access to private documents, who were present but invisible in spaces where alterations would have occurred. Prudence calculated timelines with cold precision. The ink anachronism would be discovered in at least 3 other households where members had used the same supplier James had located in 1839. The pattern would become undeniable. Once Dalton started investigating servants, the network's existence would become visible to anyone looking carefully. James estimated weeks, possibly a month, before Dalton obtained permissions for broader chemical analysis. The families showed resistance to implications that their trusted household staff might be involved in fraud. But Dalton's evidence from the Crane documents was compelling, and his persuasive arguments about investigative necessity would likely overcome initial reluctance. A month. Perhaps slightly more. They had limited time before systematic investigation turned toward them directly, before their long invisibility finally became visibility of the most dangerous kind. The decision they faced offered terrible simplicity. Flee immediately while escape remained possible, abandoning everything built over 8 years but preserving freedom and lives. Or stay and defend against exposure that seemed increasingly inevitable, risking execution or sail to the deep south but fighting for possibility that their work might somehow survive discovery. Prudence insisted on individual choice rather than collective decision. Some members were enslaved and faced different consequences than those who were free. Some had families that would be endangered by exposure. Command decisions were inappropriate when costs would be distributed so unevenly. The vote, conducted by silent gesture in Mother Bethel's basement, split precisely down the middle. 6 women chose to stay and fight. 6 chose to prepare for immediate flight north. The network that had been built over 8 years fractured along the fault line of how much risk each person could reasonably bear. Prudence numbered among those choosing to stay, along with Charlotte, Grace, and Dinah. Rebecca and 2 others would leave within the week, traveling north through underground railroad networks they had spent years supporting with redirected funds. The irony was evident to everyone. They would escape using the very systems they had helped sustain. Preparation for flight consumed 3 days of careful coordination. James used his connections to arrange passage, safe houses, documentation that would help the women reach Canada beyond fugitive slave law's reach. Money from recent operations funded the escapes, redirected wealth serving one final purpose before the system that generated it potentially collapsed. Prudence met with Rebecca the night before her departure in the small room behind the church where they had conducted so many meetings. Rebecca was 43, had served the Livingston family 19 years, and was leaving behind brutal but familiar existence for uncertainty that terrified but held possibility of actual freedom. Rebecca argued that Prudence should flee with them, that being the network's center made her the primary target for aggressive prosecution if exposure came. Prudence acknowledged the logic but explained her reasoning. If all fled, it confirmed guilt. If some stayed and defended, it created confusion about whether this represented coordinated resistance or individual actions by separate people who happened to work in connected households. Fragmented narrative would be harder to prosecute than clear conspiracy. Rebecca pressed for the real reason beyond strategic justification. Prudence struggled to articulate something she hadn't fully examined, even internally. 8 years proving capacity for systematic resistance, demonstrating that intelligence and patience could create change despite lacking power or authority. If they all fled before anyone knew what they had accomplished, that proof disappeared. The only people who would know about their work were themselves and those they had helped, most of whom didn't know who had helped them or how. Prudence wanted the truth visible. The masters who had dismissed them as incapable of complex thought, the system that had insisted they were property without human intelligence. She wanted them confronting undeniable evidence of what had actually been accomplished. Even if the cost was her own freedom or life, she wanted that truth to be inescapable. Rebecca's embrace communicated everything words couldn't. Her final instruction was simple. Whatever happened, ensure the truth got told in ways that couldn't be erased. The 6 women who fled north left minimal traces beyond vague household disruptions, their employers attributed to typical servant unreliability rather than coordinated escape. By late May, they were gone, and the network that remained consisted of 6 women who had chosen to face whatever was coming rather than run from it. Horace Dalton's comprehensive report reached affected families in early June of 1842. Prudence never saw the complete document, but she observed its impact through Harrison Whitmore's response. He called an emergency meeting of the consortium of families whose households were implicated, gathering at the Whitmore townhouse on a June evening when thunderstorms provided dramatic accompaniment to obvious crisis. Prudence served refreshments during the meeting, moving through the parlor with characteristic invisibility while the men discussed investigation findings. She heard sufficient fragments to understand that Dalton had documented a pattern of forgeries, altered contracts, and falsified charitable donations across 12 households, spanning at least 5 years. He had identified the ink anachronism in 4 separate households, proving coordination rather than isolated incidents. And he had concluded that interventions required access, literacy, and financial sophistication that pointed toward household servants as most likely perpetrators. Josiah Crane's voice carried outrage appropriate if stolen money had been his rather than wealth derived from financing slavery. The amounts totaled over $8,000, representing systematic fraud demanding criminal prosecution. Attorney Ashford countered with evidentiary challenges. Demonstrating that forgeries occurred was possible, but identifying specific perpetrators when discussing dozens of servants across multiple households presented difficulties. Harrison Whitmore had remained silent through most discussion, but finally spoke with authority, suggesting uncomfortable conclusion reached. The pattern indicated coordination and sophistication beyond what they typically attributed to servants. Whoever organized this understood their financial systems well enough to manipulate them effectively for years. That level of knowledge didn't develop spontaneously. His observation that they had been fundamentally wrong about household staff intelligence, that some possessed capabilities systematically underestimated because acknowledging those capabilities would undermine justifications for current social order, created profound discomfort in the room. Prudence, refreshing water glasses with steady hands, felt atmospheric shift. The investigation had been about stolen money and forged documents, but Whitmore's observation threatened transformation into something more dangerous. A questioning of fundamental assumptions about race and capability that the entire slavery system depended on maintaining. Attorney Ashford redirected quickly, uncomfortable with where Whitmore's logic led. Regardless of capabilities, crimes had been committed requiring prosecution. His recommendation was coordinating with authorities to conduct systematic interviews of all servants in affected households. Someone would break under questioning and provide evidence against others. The decision was made to pursue criminal investigation, the meeting concluding with agreement that local authorities would be contacted immediately. Prudence cleared glasses and plates, her face carefully neutral, while men departed into the stormy night. When the house finally quieted and she returned to her attic room, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what was coming. Days, perhaps a week, before systematic interrogation began. Days to prepare for questioning designed to break them, to extract confessions and testimony against each other, to destroy the network through its own members' fear and survival instincts. The network's final meeting happened in Charlotte's kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, 6 remaining members gathering in the space where they had taught themselves skills that sustained 8 years of resistance. The atmosphere carried weight of knowledge that this might be their last assembly before arrests began. Prudence brought something she had never shown anyone: her complete master ledger, comprehensive accounting of every operation over 8 years. The record was damning evidence if discovered, but also their only proof of what they had actually accomplished. She explained her thinking about Attorney Ashford's evidentiary challenges. Proving which specific servants were involved presented difficulties when everything had been coordinated to obscure attribution. She proposed a strategy that might protect some while ensuring truth got documented. What if one person claimed sole responsibility, created narrative where they acted alone, used their position to access multiple households through various pretexts, executed all forgeries themselves? The objections were immediate and vehement. That person would face execution or sail to the Deep South, a death sentence. Prudence agreed calmly, but it would protect others, and more importantly, it would create clear narrative that forced confrontation with what actually happened. One person, supposedly incapable of complex thought, who nevertheless manipulated Boston's commercial elite for years. That story was too compelling to suppress, too threatening to existing assumptions to ignore. The recognition that Prudence was describing her own intended sacrifice transformed discussion. Charlotte called it martyrdom disguised as strategy. Prudence rejected the characterization firmly. Martyrdom was dying for nothing. This was ensuring 8 years of work meant something beyond money redirected. This was making certain that every person who had dismissed them as incapable had to confront documented proof they were more strategically sophisticated than anyone imagined. The argument continued for hours, Women who had built this network together confronting the possibility it would end with one of them sacrificing herself to protect others and preserve truth. But ultimately, Prudence's logic proved undeniable. Single perpetrator narrative protected the network while creating story that couldn't be erased or dismissed. James Whitfield received responsibility for ensuring truth survived regardless of what happened to its architects. He would document the network's full operations, would get information to abolitionists and journalists who could use it, would make certain that Prudence's confession, when it came, was accompanied by comprehensive evidence that forced acknowledgement rather than allowing suppression. On June 15, 1842, Prudence Harrison requested private meeting with Harrison Whitmore. She entered his study carrying the master ledger, comprehensive record of 8 years' resistance, and placed it on his desk with steady hands. She informed him she needed to confess something he and other gentlemen investigating financial discrepancies needed to understand. Whitmore looked at the ledger, then at his servant of 19 years, and for the first time in their long association, he truly saw her. Not as furniture or function, but as person who had been present and attentive, and strategically patient for nearly 2 decades. He asked what the ledger represented, though something in his voice suggested he already knew. Prudence described it as an accounting of 8 years' systematic wealth redistribution. Every forged document, altered contract, and falsified receipt that redirected his money and his colleagues' money toward causes working to destroy the system they profited from. She opened the ledger to the first page, where her careful script documented the network's earliest operations. She explained that he was looking for who committed the frauds Dalton discovered. The answer was her. All of it. Every household, every intervention, every dollar moved. She had acted alone, using skills he assumed she couldn't possess, and access he granted because he never truly saw her as capable of using it against him. Whitmore read the ledger now, his face draining of color as he recognized scope and sophistication of what was documented. He protested that this wasn't possible. One person couldn't have accessed all these households, couldn't have forged documents in so many different hands, couldn't have coordinated interventions across years without help. Prudence corrected his meaning. He meant one enslaved woman couldn't have done this because he had spent his entire life believing they lacked capacity for complex strategic thought. The evidence before him proved otherwise, but he was still trying to make it fit his assumptions about what she should be capable of. She met his eyes directly, holding his gaze in a way that would have been unthinkable before this moment. She explained that she had taught herself his financial systems by reading documents he left scattered across surfaces he assumed only he could understand. She had learned to forge signatures by practicing for hours in attic room darkness. She had built intelligence networks across 12 households by being invisible enough that he never noticed she was paying attention to everything. Whitmore stated barely above a whisper that she would be executed for this. Prudence agreed, but he would spend the rest of his life knowing that his property, his trusted servant, was intelligent enough to manipulate him systematically for 8 years. And every person who saw this ledger would have to confront the same truth, that the hierarchy he had built was maintained through deliberate dismissal of their capabilities, not through actual differences in intelligence or worth. She pushed the ledger across the desk toward him. This was her confession and her accounting. He should document it, share it with investigators, use it however necessary. Just make sure the truth didn't get buried in convenient narratives that protected assumptions about who they were and what they were capable of. Whitmore sat in silence for a long time. The ledger open before him. Documented proof of 8 years' sophisticated resistance, incompatible with everything he had believed about the woman who had served his household since she was 17. Finally, he looked up at Prudence with something that might have been respect or horror, or both. He asked simply why. Prudence explained that he had spent 19 years profiting from a system treating human beings as property, separating families and stealing lives and building wealth on forced labor. And because she could. Because she was intelligent enough to see vulnerabilities in his systems and patient enough to exploit them methodically. Because someone needed to prove they were not what he had spent generations claiming they were. She turned toward the door. then paused. The money was gone, redistributed to freedom purchases and legal defenses and underground railroad operations. Over $8,000 total. He couldn't recover it. But he could choose how to tell this story. He could suppress it and pretend it never happened, protect his comfortable assumptions. Or he could let it be documented fully. Let everyone see what enslaved and servant women proved themselves capable of when given time and opportunity. She left Harrison Whitmore sitting at his desk with the ledger that would destroy her and transform everything he thought he understood about the people he had spent his life enslaving and employing. Whatever happened next would be beyond her control. But the truth was documented now, undeniable and comprehensive. Proof that intelligence and determination could create resistance, even in systems designed to make resistance impossible. The arrest came 3 days later. Prudence Harrison was taken into custody on charges of fraud, forgery, and theft, totaling over $8,000. The case drew immediate attention across Boston and beyond. Newspapers reporting the extraordinary story of an enslaved woman who had systematically manipulated some of the city's wealthiest families for nearly a decade. The trial, occurring in August of 1842, became something far more than criminal proceeding. It became public examination of slavery's fundamental assumptions, with Prudence's documented sophistication presented as evidence challenging every justification for treating human beings as property. The prosecution's case was comprehensive, built on the master ledger Prudence had provided and on testimony from handwriting experts, financial analysts, and affected families themselves. The defense, funded anonymously by abolitionists who recognized the case's significance, made the trial about more than Prudence's guilt or innocence. Her attorney, a young man named Theodore Parker, who would later become famous for anti-slavery activism, used the trial to force examination of how someone supposedly incapable of complex thought had nevertheless executed operations requiring sophisticated understanding of finance, law, and human psychology. Parker's closing argument presented the prosecution's dilemma directly. They offered evidence of remarkable intelligence, strategic planning, technical expertise, and systematic execution that would be impressive in any context. Yet they asked the jury to convict, while simultaneously maintaining that people like Prudence lacked capacity for such sophisticated thought. The contradiction was inescapable. Either she was intelligent enough to have done what evidence proved she did, or the evidence itself demonstrated that assumptions about her capabilities had always been wrong. The jury deliberated less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict. Prudence was sentenced to be sold to a plantation in Mississippi, the Deep South exile that functioned as death sentence for someone who had spent years fighting the very system she was being delivered to. But Theodore Parker had achieved his intention. The trial record documented everything: the network's operations, Prudence's confession, sophisticated methods employed over 8 years. The story spread through abolitionist networks and sympathetic newspapers, reaching audiences far beyond Boston, becoming evidence used in anti-slavery arguments across the North. The night before her scheduled transport south, Prudence received a visitor in the cell where she was being held. James Whitfield had used his connections to arrange brief private meeting, ostensibly to deliver personal effects, but actually to provide final accounting of what the network's work had achieved. Standing outside cell bars because even now proximity to an enslaved woman was regulated and controlled, James reported quietly that the truth had survived. Everything she documented was being published. Theodore Parker was writing comprehensive account. Frederick Douglass was using her case in speeches about slavery's intellectual dishonesty. William Lloyd Garrison was printing excerpts from her ledger in The Liberator. The other network members were safe. Prudence's confession had protected them. Charlotte continued working in the Crane household, though she reported servants were watched much more carefully now. Grace had left Boston but was establishing herself in Philadelphia. Dinah had purchased her freedom with money they had set aside and was teaching at a school for black children. The 6 who fled north had all reached Canada safely, were building lives there, helping other refugees from slavery establish themselves. Rebecca had asked James to convey that the accounting Prudence insisted on created more impact than any of them imagined possible. James produced a letter from his jacket, explaining that Harrison Whitmore had asked him to deliver it personally. The letter was brief, written in Whitmore's precise hand, the same hand Prudence had learned to forge perfectly over years of patient practice. Whitmore wrote that he had spent weeks since her confession examining everything he believed about human capacity and moral order. Her ledger documented not just crimes, but systematic refutation of assumptions he had built his life upon. He acknowledged that he couldn't undo the court-imposed sentence, but he could acknowledge what she proved through 8 years of work he never detected, that intelligence and determination existed independent of race or legal status, that the hierarchy he participated in was maintained through deliberate blindness rather than natural order. She had asked whether he would let truth be documented fully. He had given all records to abolitionists for publication. Her accounting would be known, would serve as evidence against the system that created necessity for such resistance. He didn't request forgiveness. He had none to give himself. But he wanted her to know that one person whose certainty she shattered understood now what she was teaching through every intervention, that they made themselves into something less than human by insisting she was less than human, that the real crime was never her resistance, but the system that made resistance necessary. Prudence read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and returned it to James. She instructed him to ensure this got published too. It was part of the accounting, proof that truth forced at least one person to question everything. James asked quietly about her. The abolitionists were trying to arrange escape before transport. It was possible. Difficult, but possible. Prudence refused firmly. Escape would undermine everything the trial documented. They needed to see her face the sentence, needed to confront what they did to people who dared to resist. The truth had to be complete, including its cost. James nodded slowly, understanding even if he disagreed. He promised to make sure her accounting survived. Every operation, every method, every lesson learned. Other networks in other cities would know what she accomplished and how. Prudence stated that was all she wanted. Not escape or pardon, just documentation that couldn't be erased. The truth about what they were capable of when given opportunity, about what intelligence could achieve even without power. Let that be the legacy, not her fate, but the proof they created together. Prudence Harrison was transported to Mississippi in September of 1842, sold to a plantation where her literacy and financial sophistication were liabilities rather than assets, where skills developed over 8 years of resistance marked her as dangerous rather than valuable. The historical record shows she survived less than 2 years before dying of what was officially recorded as pneumonia. But what people who knew plantation conditions understood was systematic destruction that awaited enslaved people who demonstrated too much intelligence, too much resistance, too much unwillingness to accept their designated place. But the network's accounting survived and spread. Theodore Parker's comprehensive documentation of their operations became required reading in abolitionist circles. Frederick Douglass cited Prudence's case in speeches as proof that slavery's justifications were built on deliberate lies about human capacity. The Master Ledger, with its coded entries documenting 8 years of systematic resistance, was copied and distributed, becoming template for other resistance networks in other cities. The 5 women who had chosen to stay and fight alongside Prudence survived the investigation her confession deflected from them. They continued their lives as servants and freed women, carrying knowledge of what they had accomplished and proved, but never speaking of it publicly. The 6 who had fled north built new lives in Canada, helping other refugees establish themselves, passing down stories about the network that proved the possible existed beyond what power claimed was allowed. James Whitfield maintained the accounting until his death in 1867, adding documentation of later resistance movements that built on methods the original network developed. His papers, donated to the Massachusetts Historical Society, included comprehensive records of the network's operations, correspondence with members who had fled north, and follow-up accounts of how their methods influenced other resistance efforts across the North. Harrison Whitmore spent the remaining decade of his life divesting from slavery-connected investments, though he never achieved complete moral transformation his letter to Prudence hinted at. He died in 1852, moderately wealthy but haunted by knowledge that his most trusted servant had been sophisticated enough to manipulate him systematically for years, while he remained completely oblivious. The other families affected by the network's operations responded in various ways. Some increased surveillance of servants, implementing controls designed to prevent similar resistance. Others freed their enslaved staff, though usually through gradual processes that protected their financial interests. A few, genuinely shaken by documented proof of their servants' capabilities, became supporters of abolition, though they remained a minority. But the truth Prudence had insisted on documenting survived all attempts at suppression or revision. The accounting existed, comprehensive and undeniable, proof that enslaved and servant women had built sophisticated resistance network that operated successfully for 8 years, that had redistributed over $8,000 from slavery's beneficiaries to causes working to destroy the system, that had helped dozens of families purchase freedom and had funded legal defenses that saved lives. The numbers told one story: 47 operations across 12 households, 23 families freed, 12 fugitives defended, support provided to underground railroad networks in 4 states. But the deeper accounting was what those numbers represented. Proof that intelligence existed independent of legal status, that strategic sophistication could develop despite systematic denial of education, that resistance was possible even in systems designed to make resistance impossible. The garden Prudence had carefully cultivated for 8 years produced harvest beyond what any of them imagined possible when they began with a single, falsified receipt. Not in total destruction of an evil system, though they had contributed to pressure that would eventually help bring that destruction, but in undeniable documentation that people dismissed as incapable of complex thought, could prove more strategically sophisticated than those who dismissed them. That truth, once documented, could not be erased. It spread through abolitionist networks, appeared in speeches and pamphlets, influenced resistance movements that built on methods the original network developed, and in the invisible spaces between power and resistance, between dismissal and proof, between what people claimed was possible and what determined intelligence could actually achieve, the accounting continued. Prudence Harrison died in Mississippi in 1844, but the network's legacy survived. In methods that influenced later resistance movements, in documented proof that challenged slavery's fundamental assumptions, in truth that couldn't be suppressed once it was comprehensively recorded. The accounting she insisted on preserving, even at cost of her own freedom and life, became evidence used in arguments that would eventually help dismantle the very system she had spent 8 years carefully, methodically, systematically resisting. The final entry in James Whitfield's maintained records, written in 1865 after the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, was brief but comprehensive. The accounting was complete. The truth had survived. What 12 women proved possible in Boston between 1834 and 1842 helped change what a nation believed was true about human capacity and moral order. Let the record show they were sophisticated enough to manipulate systems that claimed they lacked such sophistication. Let history remember what they achieved against impossible odds. Let the accounting stand as their monument, and it did, preserved in archives and referenced in histories. Proof that intelligence and determination could create resistance even when power insisted resistance was impossible. That patient cultivation of small interventions could eventually produce harvest that transformed understanding, that the invisible could make themselves undeniably seen through accounting they carefully, methodically insisted on documenting. The garden had grown. The truth had survived. And the reckoning Prudence Harrison worked 8 years to create continued long after she was gone, forcing confrontation with realities that comfortable assumptions tried to deny, proving through comprehensive documentation what she had known from the beginning, that they were always capable of everything claimed they weren't, that the only real difference was opportunity and determination, that the accounting, once complete, could never truly be erased.